Hi there, I'm Gadiopa. I'm doing this recording as a requirement for the hiring process of manual backend engineer position. So I will jump right in by the first question, which includes code review. So before getting into the subject matter, we need to be clear with some standards and assumptions I made. So I will be following the Symfony coding standard throughout this presentation. We are in a checkout cart environment. What that implies is we don't really have to worry about the crude operation of the product. So we definitely just care about what information is gotten from that and is stored somewhere. Another thing is this session info needs to be persisted, hence need for traffic stats. So it doesn't make sense to send traffic back to the server if it's just to calculate some data. So we assume that if there's need for it, then there's a catching purpose for that. So we will be working on optimization method to actually handle that data and do the calculation that actually are involved. So the global overview, we have two classes, the other class and the other item. The other item, which is a composite of the other class. Then basically what we are going to do is code review and optimization, where we can actually have where code can actually be optimized. So let's start with the simplest class. We have the other item. So it's basically it's a single attribute class with a controller and a getter. So trivial issues, we have no validator at the place of the controller. Then we have no ID. Yeah. On the backend side, it might make sense to actually compare objects using the identity operator. But if you send that data to the front end, let's say via JSON or XML, that does not make sense because you just have an array of objects containing one single field or one single attribute called price. uh yeah, it doesn't really make sense. So that's an issue. So loosely type. So coming from a background like JavaScript, I know we can actually manage writing code this way, but to ensure robustness and ensure stability of the system, I think at least at the level of functions, uh, we should use strongly typed paradigm. So some quick fixes. So I talked about the ID field that needed to be added. Then validation at the level of the constructor. So we have an ID field and a float for a price. So that imposes on the caller to respect that standards. So we also have some validation at the level of the price. So that's some trivial validation, and we have normal getters. So as we said, we don't care about the product itself. That's why we work only with the getter value, so we don't work with the setters. So oops, sorry. um, Other constructor. So let's go to the second class. We have a class with uh, 1 plus 3 attribute. What I mean by that is we have a main attribute, other item, and 3 other attributes that are sort of metadata of the first one mentioned above. So we have 4 accessor methods, 4 getters, then we have 2 mutators. I think we have the add item and remove item. We have a constructor and a factory method here, which is the calculate totals. So at first glance, we see the naming convention is not really good because we have verbs like count items, sum price, which does not really convey the sense of what we are trying to do here. We are having class instance variables, so we should use names like item count instead of count items. And at the level of the constructor, we don't really the code does not really check if data is being given. So if we give an array with no data, or what would actually happen, because we are actually looping, doing a safe for loop on the item. So what if the array is empty, or what if nothing was sent at all? Another thing, why use two for loops instead of one? So stuff like that make us think this setup method is really it does not stand straight. So we have the setters. So going to the setters, these setters mutate the data, the other item, and the metadata that's attached to it are not changed, like the sum price, max price, and all. So I'll also make abstraction of the getters, and jump straight in solving both issues highlighted before. So here is a sort of rebrand of of the setter, sorry, of the constructor of the factory method. So I prefer calling it setup here. So we have a count. It Let's start with the constructor. It receives a very how do I say, an optional argument that's other items. So if it's not null and it has at least one element, it calls the function setup. Else it actually gives it the default values of empty and array, and zero for the other metadata. So when we come to the setup method, we actually initialize the metadata. We use an inbuilt sorting method to actually sort the items in the list with respect to price. Why this design strategy? This is simply because we are having an array of objects here, and so a search operation across that is log O to the n, which might not disturb if you have orders with, let's say, 10 products. But what if you have to do that repetitively with 1,000 people on a server and workload? So we have to find out ways of optimizing the searching and the removal operations. So uh, we actually see that we sorted the items with respect to the price. That will help later when as we go to the mutators functions. So normal operation to get the sum, and this is quite optional for getting the max price. Why is that? Because when the items are sorted, we simply have to take the last element and we will get the max price. And an extra train exception. So it makes sense train and a meaningful exception in a controller. So what if we have an issue there? Uh, we should not actually use data that does not make sense. If an item there is not valid, we actually send it back to the caller. So he gets the error right in the initialization. So the the first mutator, which is adding of item or items. So here we what we do is, since at the level of the constructor we've sorted the values, um, rather than appending the other item at the end of the list, which will make searching operation difficult, we actually use the variation of the binary search method. So a binary search, as we know, is actually O to the log n, which is really optimal for finding an item in a sorted list. So when we find the position, we actually insert the object at that position, and we do some update, and we update the what I say, the fields. That's other items, the sum, and and the max price. Then we go to the removal of items. So we also use a sort of a tweak of the binary search function to actually find the position of the item we are searching for. So it might surprise someone to actually see other item as argument for this function, but the assumption here is, if you want to delete an item, you must have it. So it's if you want to delete an item, you just send the object and we get the price and the ID to make sure we are actually working with we want to delete the correct item, because we should not fall in a scenario where we delete another item just because he had the same price. So another addition, here we have a get item count, which actually returns a count of the list. I think this makes sense because uh, the issue we raised a few minutes ago was that The previous mutators were actually forgetting to update the metadata. So we might think that's trivial, but if you have 10 methods, maybe modifying the list or whatever, we might at some point forget to update one of those mutators. So having a getter function that takes a log O to the one to take the size of an array, I think it makes more sense than having a variable to store its value. It should have totally that's my point of view on the. It might also depend on some people who want to implement it some other way. So possible improvements. So we might actually use an associate array with the product ID that was added as a key. The reason I didn't do that was simply because I actually know migrating code and optimizing code is something that might include breaking changes. So rather than having to change the whole chain, like from the users and of this method, is better to use something that existed and uh, migrate the code incrementally. So provide response for callers of mutators. So what this means is simply if we call the add other item, if it's successful, at least it's supposed to send a flag or maybe a predefined message or whatever, depending on the convention that has been agreed upon by the different developers. So it makes some sense. Else we might actually use the silence is gold principle. So if we receive nothing, that's totally fine. But if there's an issue, an exception should be raised. So those are possible improvements. So I will dive directly into question 2. That's the designing workshop. So I would also like to apologize about the quality of audio and the slides. I actually did it without taking some time, like the slide numbering and all the stuff. So first thing, I'll also go with the standards. So here I'll be using UML standards, which can be found at this link, and input, the input types. You can actually get those at the HTML spec website. And here we are using structured databases. So I think that's what you guys use. And page are not server rendered. So that's an assumption that was made. So to take in account the worst case scenario, because even if it's server side rendered, the architecture proposed will actually be able to solve that. So we took the how do I say, the long path, taking into account if we had to provide APIs for that. So the global architecture. So we had as design requirement products which can actually have a product which has a questionnaire, and the same questionnaire can be used by several products. So that's an association. Then we have a questionnaire and a section. So let me explain this section included here. So while coming up with this design, I actually thought it would make sense to have questions that repeat themselves in different questionnaires. That so rather than making them directly dependent on the questionnaire, we could actually create a sort of how do I say, temporal safeguard, so that if the questionnaire is being deleted, the questions are saved. So take questions like what is your name or what is your age, or stuffs that are recurring. Another point for adding the section is it makes more sense to organize a questionnaire in sections, and it also makes sense if we are to keep the answering process in a database. So we have, let's say, 20 questions, we can have it in 4 sections, like introduction, uh, let's say medical past records, current record, whatever. So being stored in sections would help the patient, even on from the UI perspective, to be able to answer those questions conveniently and be able to resume. Another point for including this section is due to another functional requirement, that was the activation of a question based on a previous one. So did you have a heart attack? If the answer is yes, when was that, or whatever. So questions that are dependent on others. So if we put the trigger at the level of the questions, and it turns out that a question how do I say, is a dependent of, or maybe 10 questions depend on one, it won't make sense to actually modify all those. And if we do that, what will be the condition? So it will actually brings a lot of complexity in there. So rather than putting each question, rather than putting the dependency on each question, it's better to group those questions that depend on or on a how do I say, predefined answer to be shown. At the level of the section, we have an ID, a title, instruction. That's maybe an instruction to the user. Then we have a trigger. The trigger actually takes the ID of a question. Then we have the trigger condition. So at this level, I thought about different possibilities. So since we might have several answer types like free text, multiple choice questions, and several answer questions, it's difficult to have a how do I say, a strict how do I say, a strict formal language, I will say it that way, to define that if this, if that. So we might include here a domain specific language, or where we could use small symbols like if this greater than that, we could make this question active. So that's the point of the trigger condition. So here we could work this out. If this equals to this, so for instance, if age range equals to 12 to 25, we might put this section might load instead of that other section. So the trigger condition actually gives space for the development of a domain specific language for question triggering by others. So from that, you have actually move to the questions proper. So talking about the question, we can't talk about a question without an answer. And here we can have several types of answer. I talked about the MCQ, the multiple choice question, which could also be a select box or whatever on the front end. So its characteristics is it has a set of predefined options, and it can take one of those options as the current answer. Then we have the free text. So the free text can be used for stuff like email, phone number. Uh, so we could refer to the HTML input standards I actually included in the standard above to see the fields that would enter as free text. Uh, as a small modification, we could also have the URI or the URL, depending on the case, of stored data images as free text. And you could also have multiple answers, which is a variation of the MCQ, where we could have several options being selected as answers. So here we have question and answer entity. So here we have a question that has its fields, text, the question itself, the instruction, uh, where you could actually convey meaningful message to the user. Then the answer type, which is an enum. Then we have a sort of transitive object entity, that's answer, which has an ID and a question. So here MCQ is actually a dependent is a form, is an answer, multiple answer is an answer, free text are answers. So think of it as interface in a normal OOP paradigm. So here, as we mentioned, we have options that are dependent on the either MCQ or multi answers. So here we have chosen a chosen flag that tells us if a particular option is chosen. So at the level of implementation, the developer will have to go an extra mile for the MCQ to actually make all the other options false and keep only one as correct. So as addition, we can have validation as dependency injection. So what we could typically do there is put validators there like max size, length, and other conditions we might define. that are also available in the HTML standard documentation. So comments. Free text needs a type specified in the input standard reference before. Yes, for file uploads, the URI or URL should be stored in place of text. So that's basically what I just mentioned. So moving from that, we have these are the possible class diagrams, and I made abstraction of the normal getters and setters, and what interests us here, for instance, in answer are get answer, which actually takes in an answer that's either MCQ, multi answer, or free text. So typically that's an interface that's to be realized or implemented by the free text, multi answer, or MCQ. So that's what you get as class diagrams. An answer that's dependent on the question, and you have a dependency injection for the validator. So that's it. So what will the data being sent to the front end look like? So in the case of a multi answer, we could have the ID of the question, the text instruction, answer type, which was the enum, and the options, which is actually the answer the of type multi answer, which returns an array of options, and those options have the flag either chosen true or chosen false. Then we go to the free text answers. So it's typically the same approach: ID, text, instruction, answer type. So the front end developer should expect, if I have a free text, I should be expecting an object answer which contains a text and an HTML type, which typically is an either tel, name, zip, or email. Here we have a single answer with predefined answers, so technically MCQs. So we have variable numbers of options, and we have one that is either chosen, or the others that are false. So technically that's how the design uh, this architecture is going to look on the front end. So the resources I used for this were UMLito. That's an open source and free software for online design of UML diagrams, and that I used for the conception of the class diagrams you saw and entities. I used Dropbox as a storage mechanism for UMLito, which permits collaborative work if you have several teams working on those diagrams. So I use Google Slide for this presentation, and Google Drive for asset storage. And as I record this video, you should actually get a link from to watch this video. So thank you for taking time to actually watch this presentation, and hope to see you soon for hopefully for the next phase. Thanks.